Hello and welcome. His successful efforts for the release of hostages in Iran and Libya eventually led to him being kidnapped himself and held in Lebanon for almost 5 years. He's moved on but says there were many lessons to be learned from that time in Middle East history. This week on One, meet former captive and author Terry Waite. After years of working with the Anglican Church in Africa and Europe, he was recruited to be advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1980. But Terry Waite came to international prominence when he took on the task of negotiating the release of several hostages from Iran, and then negotiating in 1983 with Libya's Colonel Muammar Gaddafi for the successful release of British hostages held there. In January 1987, while trying to free Western hostages in Lebanon, Waite himself was taken captive and held for 1,763 days, the first 4 years of which were spent in total solitary confinement. His captors accused him of being an American spy, unwitting or not, due to his contact with the U.S. Marine Colonel Oliver North, who headed a covert arms for hostages deal with Iran. Following his release in November 1991, Waite turned to writing, lecturing, and humanitarian activities. Now approaching 70, Waite is involved with a number of charities in Britain, South Africa, and Kosovo. He also recently co-founded Hostage UK, an organisation designed to give support to the families of hostages. Terry Waite, great to have a chance to chat with you, and thanks for your time. I want to just touch on, it's been nearly 15 years, or about 15 years actually, since you came back into reality, or the real world, so to speak. How have you been focusing your time? What have you been focused on more recently?
Well, I look back on those 15 years, and when I came out, it was a pretty confusing time, because I'd been cut off totally from the outside world. And I determined that my priorities ought to be, first of all, to get to know my family again. When I went in captivity, my son was 14, and he was a young man when I came out. I didn't recognize him. And so first of all, to get to know the family again, to come to terms with the world as it had changed. And I didn't want to take up my old job because the Archbishop of Canterbury, for whom I worked, had retired, and a new Archbishop was in his place. I was elected to a fellowship in Cambridge, Trinity Hall. And I just went there in the middle of the week and then went home at weekends. And that was a good pattern because it gave me time to study, to read, to write. And it also gave me time then to adjust to the family as the family had changed and adjust to life again. And during that time, I put my first book down on paper. I say put on paper, say it deliberately because I wrote it in my head.
And you handwrote it as well?
I handwrote it in college, yeah, I handwrote it. Because I didn't want anything to come between, what I had written up here, or as little as possible to come between that and the actual words. After that, I made up my mind that I'd earn my own living and I wouldn't go back to any salaried job. I'd earn my living by writing and lecturing and give half the year away to a variety of causes. And I've been doing that for the last almost 15 years now.
Let me ask you a little bit about the way the world you knew at that time in the 80s has changed. I mean, Beirut has gone through a kind of revival and then going through political turmoil again. Hostage taking has become a media daily event almost now. And I wonder how you view what happens nowadays in terms of the way hostages are taken with what was happening when you were negotiating for the freedom of hostages back in the 80s.
Well, just to go back for a second to those days, the world changed dramatically while I was in captivity. I mean, I used to get messages tapped through the wall to me from Terry Anderson, the American hostage who was the other side of the wall. I never believed I should see the end of apartheid in South Africa or the fall of the Berlin Wall. All that happened while I was in captivity. It came through.
In terms of this, specifically in terms of the hostage taking, it seems just much more violent now. The whole issue of beheadings and the sort of public display seems to be stronger than it ever was.
What I've done is I've founded in the UK a little group called Hostage UK, which is specifically designed to give support to hostage families because there's such a big need. But you're quite right. hostage-taking has become much more violent than it was in my day. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is the situation has become so much more polarized, so much more extreme.
It became evident eventually that you were essentially used by the US, that your life was actually put in danger by things that were going on, politicking that was going on behind your back. How do you look back on that?
Well, in this particular way, there's no doubt at all, yes, that one was used. And it all evolved around the Iran-Contra affair. Now, genuinely, I knew nothing about Iran-Contra, not a thing about it. My captors took me on the understanding, from their point of view, that they thought that I did know something, and any interrogation I got in captivity was all centered around what I knew about Iran-Contra. It was one of those occasions when, you know, I was very glad I could stand on the truth. And eventually they believed me. I think if they hadn't believed me, I'm not sure I'd be here today talking to you.
Let me ask you how you view the US policy in the Middle East right now, then, where it's claiming, of course, that what it's trying to do is promote democracy and improve the safety of the world and fight global terror.
Totally and completely disastrous, in my view. Before the Iraq War, I made my views very clear. So I'm not just being smart after the event now, because nothing worse than that. Before the Iraq War, I said this. I said, if we go into Iraq and remove a dictator by force, what we stand in grave danger of doing is releasing the forces that he's held down by his dictatorial power. And we'll probably create a situation which becomes unmanageable. That's the first thing I said. And the second thing I said was that if you do that, you'll very likely create a situation which proves to be a recruiting ground for young people to enter into more terrorist acts. You cannot stick democracy on a country as you stick a postage stamp on a letter. And certainly a model of democracy that may come from America or from Britain, you can't just transpose it into the Middle East like that, nor should you try.
Let me take you through your past a little bit, and your childhood, which was dominated by a fairly strong father who was a policeman. And I wonder, looking back on that time in your life, describe it for me and how it perhaps shaped you and the decisions you made later in life.
Well, my father was a very intelligent man who never had a chance to have a university education because he was brought up in the Depression. And he left home, he ran away from home, in fact, and had a very, very hard time as a young man. But he was a hard worker, and he did his best for himself and for his family. But he was a very strong disciplinarian in many ways. In fact, I remember being afraid of him. I never came to terms with him until right at the end, when I had to tell him, because I'd been to his doctor and spoken with his doctor, I had to tell him that he had terminal cancer and he had a few months to live. I always remember, I went to his bedside and told him that, and he said, "That's not so, is it?" I said, "Yeah, it is." And at that point, the relationship changed somewhat. There was much more human empathy and understanding. And I thought, well, the first time in my life, really, I've come close to him.
You were, by your own words, a loner, and I wonder if you were unhappy to that extent.
Not particularly unhappy. No, I wouldn't say so.
You were born just in time for World War II.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't have much of a hand in it, I tell you.
and grew up in that sort of post-war environment in Britain, and, which was a tough time, obviously. And I wonder what memories stick of the hardships that you had in the 40s in Britain.
Oh, I remember being terrified. I mean, this is one of the things that stays with me, and where again I have great empathy for and sympathy for kids brought up in warfare. My God. I mean, mine was nothing compared to what some children have to face today. But I remember being absolutely terrified when I heard doodlebugs go over our house. Doodlebugs were flying bombs. The time to worry was when the engine cut out. When you heard it go over and then suddenly the engine cut out, you knew it was going to come down any moment. And I remember an air raid warden coming to the house and saying to my mother, my father was out, he was on patrol, There's a bomb landed in the front garden and a bomb in the back garden. I'd been scared stiff. We were just by ourselves in the house. I remember the deprivations of the food ration. A small piece of cheese about that big. My mother saying, "How on earth are we going to feed a family with that? Just that much." But putting it into context, it was nothing compared to what lots have to face today. And when I think of all the deprivation in the world today, we were pretty fortunate.
The church, I mean, I know you've always had that connection with it, but I gather from what I've read in your book that you have a more cynical view, or perhaps skeptical view, of organised religion now.
Well, yes, in some ways, yes. I don't have a great deal of patience with organised religion these days. I do believe this very clearly, that it's important to have some framework and some structure to give you some context for a spiritual life. That I believe. And so therefore I don't ignore it totally. But I'm primarily not a maintenance person, which is a clergyman's role, I think. I'm primarily someone who likes to get out and face challenges and do new things.
Terry Waite, stay with me. We're going to take a short break here, watching 101. We'll be back in just a moment.